I love when a hush comes over the crowd. And I'm no one. Good evening. Good evening. I'm Beth Needle. I'm the Executive Director of the Lafayette Library and Learning Center Foundation. And on behalf of the library and the foundation, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Distinguished Speaker Series event this evening. This brilliant program, come on out. We're missing one more person. Shall I continue?
I didn't know you were going to start.
No. Oh, we talk like this all the time.
Yeah.
Oh. All right, I'll just do my boring part. So this brilliant program, like many of the other 1,100 programs that we host at the library this year, are brought to you through the generous contributions of authors and donors and friends of the Lafayette Library and their contributions both financially and through their time. This library is a little different. It's got a unique structure. So the foundation is responsible for raising 52% of the operating budget for the Lafayette Library and Learning Center. Friends bring in another 8%. So about 60% of the operations for this library are brought in through donations. And an evening like this does a lot to help us bring the money in. I just want to give you a sample of some of the programs that we do here. And I want to give you an example of the programs, for example, that we did this week. Last Saturday, I was at French and Portuguese Storytime. Yesterday, we had Tale of Two Conductors with the California Symphony, followed by Classic Book Club. Tuesday, we had Spanish Storytime, Sit and Play Storytime, Tai Chi, Science Cafe with Margaret Reyes. Today was a slow day. We had Nature Journaling with John Muir-Laws, Teen Tech Help, World of Wonder with Casanova, the Seduction of Europe through the Legion of Honors. This program this evening, tomorrow night, is Sweet Thursday, where Bianca Bosker is going to talk about her new book, Cork Dork. So if you like to drink and read, it's perfect. Friday, we have AARP doing free tax help. And the Contra Costa Performing Arts Symphony is coming back. And Saturday, we kind of end with French and Mandarin Storytime. So all these programs, you don't see them at every library around town or in the county or around the country. So thanks to you, we're able to do these types of things. I thought it was for me. And now, our program this evening is of groundbreaking significance for the Lafayette Library. We welcome a trio of talented authors. Miss Joyce Carol Oates, our very first writer-in-residence. Mr. T. Geronimo Johnson, the very first recipient of the Simpson Family Literary Projects Prize. And our moderator, author, philanthropist, founder of the Simpson Family Project, friend of the library, and the cover boy for this lovely magazine, Mr. Joe DePrisco. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. Can you all hear me? Brian, are we cool back there? Brian in the control room? Excellent. Lovely to see so many friends of the library and the project here tonight. And I have to congratulate Beth Needle, the ED of the foundation, and Vicki Shaka, who's the manager of the library, for all they do every single day. They're great. So we're going to be live streaming tonight. Yeah, high tech. And afterwards, the program will be on our library channel, YouTube. So when you're having a sleepless night tonight, you could watch us again, if you so feel like it. So Beth mentioned these. What's the matter? You can't hear? That's why I was doing. Hello? Is that good? Let's try that. Sound check. How's that, Vicki? Excellent. All right. So a word about the Simpson Family Literary Project. I won't talk about it for long. But the Simpson Family Literary Project is the result of the partnership between the Lafayette Library Learning Center Foundation and the University of California at Berkeley English Department. It's a unique private-public partnership, and it's dedicated to the proposition that storytelling is the foundation of a literate society. And I urge you all to go to our website, Simpson Literary Project. You'll see the kinds of things we're doing. We've just released the list of finalists for our second Simpson Prize winner, and that'll be announced within the month. We are beginning our writing workshops, Simpson writing workshops taught by Simpson Fellows, who are professional writers and graduate students from the University of California at Berkeley. And they're taking place at Contra Costa County Juvenile Hall, Girls Inc. in Alameda County, and Northgate High School down the road. And so this is a brand new project. This is our second year, feels new. And we're honored so much that Geronimo Johnson can be here tonight. So let me just say a few words about Geronimo. He was born in New Orleans, a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and a former Stegner Fellow at Stanford, which is a university down the peninsula. And he's taught at Berkeley, at Stanford, at the Writers Workshop, the Prague Summer Program, Oregon State University, San Quentin, and elsewhere. He's been long-listed for the National Book Award, long-listed for the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction, a finalist for the Bridge Book Award, a finalist for the Mark Twain American Voice Award in Literature, awarded the Soroyan International Prize for Writing, named the winner of the 2015 Ernest J. Gaines Award for Literary Excellence, and the inaugural Simpson Prize. He's just flown in from Rome a couple of days ago, where he's spent the year as a very prestigious fellow of the American Academy, and also acquiring colorful expressions to use for Italian drivers. Maybe Rita can help you with that later. Anyway, he is spending 2 weeks here in Lafayette and in Berkeley as part of his residence and part of the Simpson Project Prize. So in the words of Joyce Carol Oates, T. Geronimo Johnson is a brilliantly inventive, audacious, ever-surprising, yet warmly sympathetic chronicler of our turbulent America of the early 21st century. Now, as for readers will find it touching and hilarious by turns, welcome to Braggsville, tragic and revelatory, wise beyond the years of its young and dazzlingly talented young author. And let me say a few words about Joyce Carol Oates. You all know Joyce Carol Oates is a giant. It would be impossible to suggest the depth, breadth, and scope of her achievement. I might mention her many, many, many prizes and honors, but then we wouldn't get to talk tonight. All the honors I would mention would barely scratch the surface of her achievement. She is also a distinguished professor of humanities at Princeton University and currently visiting professor at Berkeley. And she's spoken movingly about teaching at Princeton and Berkeley and NYU and at San Quentin, something that Geronimo and Joyce have in common. And she, of course, is the author of countless, and I mean countless, enduring works of fiction and nonfiction and memoirs. Her most recent wonderful book is a collection of stories, recently out, about love, deception, and intrigue, titled Beautiful Days. And she's here with us, as Beth mentioned, as the Lafayette Library and Simpson Project writer in residence. So we have a warm welcome for Geronimo and Joyce, please. My plan as moderator tonight is that you both have a conversation with each other, and maybe you'll find the opportunity to remark upon each other's work and career as we proceed. Here you are, writers of different generations, races, experiences, cultural contexts, and I think our audience is going to find fascinating points of intersection and points of difference, unless I totally mess up, which there stands a good chance that I'll do. But let's all hold a good thought. You can't hear me again? Yeah, we're watching. Oh, okay. Same to you. Okay, good. Okay, so let's begin in the moment. Here we are in a beautiful library. I'm wondering, Joyce and Geronimo, if you have any thoughts about the place of libraries in your life or in our culture. What do you think the future is of libraries? Did you have important experiences growing up in a library?
Well, to me, libraries from my earliest childhood were places almost like churches or cathedrals. So I think because I'm of a certain generation and came from a rural community, I probably have a much more like mythological feeling about libraries than people may who grew up right in a community like this, because this is an extraordinary library. It's just amazing. It's sort of like a fantasy place. The library that I first went to when I was a girl was a smaller library, but to me it was like a palace. And I lived on a small farm, and we came into the city once in a while, and I would go to this, to me, beautiful library, and it was like a place of wonder. So I've never gotten over that. To me, a library is just a very, very special place. But I also like little libraries that are sort of back woods areas, and where it's like one room, and there are not that many books, but there's a certain feeling. So I have this kind of fantastical, mystical feeling about libraries.
I feel strongly about libraries, though I don't think about them as much as I did when I was, say, in grad school or elementary and going to the libraries all the time. But one of the things that I would not have said before you asked this question tonight is that a library, to me, I realize, is sort of a symbol or a statement about how much culture values knowledge and also each other and the exchange of ideas. And also, it tells you a lot about a school. And I'm thinking just back to my experiences, because I was at a public school in New Orleans for a part of high school, and then I was in Columbia, Maryland at an experimental open space school for elementary and middle and part of high school. And in my middle school and elementary school and high school in Maryland, the library was in the center of the building, and you couldn't go anywhere without seeing it. And so it was like sort of like a community center. But then at this school in New Orleans, the library was in a room that was tucked off in the corner behind a door. There was only one way in and one way out, and it was kind of like a cul-de-sac. And you could spend months there and not even know where the library was. So I was going to say a little bit about the time my friend was going to run away, so we went to the library in Columbia to look up books on camping and whatnot. But now I'm at this moment. When you say start the moment, I'm just thinking more so about how our structuring of the library says so much about how in that community we value knowledge and we value the people in that community.
That's great. To stay in the moment just a little bit longer, shifting our lens just a little bit. So today, I found it very inspiring that high school kids walked out at 10 o'clock. And I'm wondering, Geronimo and Joyce, you're dealing with adolescents. You know adolescents always obey, and they're very polite, and they don't do things like that usually. So I'm wondering, let me frame this in the most broad way I can. Are high school kids going to save our country? And you, Geronimo, was in a high school classroom today at Northgate High School. Did that happen? Next week. I knew that. I was just testing him to see if he was paying attention. Okay.
I arrived and they had walked out.
Oh, no. Oh, no. High school. It's So anyway, so what do you think about where we stand in this country? What about these teenagers? I mean, it happened in the Vietnam War. The kids had a big impact. Yeah.
Oh, I think it's thrilling. It's really exciting, and it's so uplifting to the spirit. Because some of us have been feeling sort of demoralized for some time. And this is such a sense of unity and courage, and also the young people are very articulate. And I had been thinking how in the 1960s, especially the later 1960s, the anti-Vietnam War, the protesters were a generational phenomenon to some extent, I mean, pretty much. Protesting an unconscionable war that they felt was evil, but they also didn't want to die in it. The young men didn't want to be drafted. And here we have a replication of that feeling that there's something unconscionable. It's a stranglehold that the NRA has on certain politicians, and the young people quite reasonably don't want to die again. They don't want to be shot. So there's sort of an interesting parallel, I think, between the two phenomena.
So
Please.
Today I had 3 exchanges with other adults about adulthood, work, life, and the fact that they don't really like their jobs. And it's funny, but it's not. And so I think about adulthood as being so much about compromise, right? This is what happens. You sort of age out of your dreams. And so I think that it's always up to the students, because the students haven't yet been concretized by adulthood. The students still believe that change is possible. You become an adult and you think, I'd like to see this change, but it's inconvenient. You know, I would like to see this war end, but I don't have time for that. I would like to see, women get equal pay, but I've got other stuff to do. And so it's always going to be up to the younger generation because they still believe.
That's wonderful. So when you think about, let's think about what's happening on college campuses these days. You guys are both very involved in education. I mean, what is the atmosphere in college campuses? Have college students changed in this generation? Has something shifted for them when it comes to writing, when it comes to politics? Do you see anything going on that's encouraging to you? Does it make, I'm going to keep talking to you, unless you stop me.
Well, it depends upon the context, actually. And when people talk about young people generally, I think it's very difficult to have any really helpful adjectives. I'm teaching at NYU, and I have slightly older students. At Berkeley, I have undergraduates, but I have 5 PhD candidates, so they're just a little bit older. Then I have a woman who's probably 35 or maybe even 40 who's sort of a special undergraduate. So they're so diverse. It's really hesitant to draw any conclusions. Princeton is much more homogeneous, and I have 10 students usually who are of a certain age, between the ages of 18 and 20, around in that. And they seem very idealistic, and they're committed also to community projects, and they're concerned with social justice, I believe. But whether I can speak generally for millions of young people, I'm not so sure that that's helpful.
Well, for instance, you and I were talking the other day about this. The right wing loves to color what's going on in campuses. The specter of cultural misappropriation is something that people trot out all the time. Not that I watch Fox News, honest, but I hear rumors, and I'm wondering, is this when it comes? And I'm actually thinking about it in terms of writing. Your writing students. Are there ways in which students are censoring themselves? Are there ways in which they're more liberated than they used to be? What do you think?
In my experience at Iowa and some other places, the students are very, 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 very sensitive to the fact that you should be careful about claiming someone else's experiences or suffering as your own. And what this means to me, unfortunately, is that often they shy away from writing about some of the things that really matter to them because they're afraid to get it wrong, or they're afraid that they'll be accused of co-opting. And I try to encourage them to do quite the opposite, because I think that there's space for personal growth, and also, when someone goes to buy a book, they are going to take into consideration the race and the gender, just the social profile of that author, and they listen differently. And so I think it's important for everyone to explore fully the world as it interests them, because one of the great benefits of literature is that it develops empathy in people, right? It's the machinery of empathy. So I tend to tell my students that if they are afraid to do something, that's probably what they should be doing.
So in your, Geronimo was the commencement speaker at the English department, May 20th, 2017. He gave a brilliant commencement speech. And it was all about, well, it was about everything, but it was about storytelling and about how storytelling is going to save these kids. Learning how to tell stories, learning how to read stories, and how education, you quote H.G. Wells, education is the bulwark against catastrophe. And you ended with this, the magnificent motto of the University of California, that is fiat lux. And you chanted it, and you almost had everybody in tears with that. So could you say more? And Joyce, I'd love you to weigh in on this too. Could you say more about storytelling, its centrality to these kids' lives and to your life?
Well, storytelling is obviously inborn in the human psyche, and everybody is telling stories constantly. Some of the stories are mythological, some of them are factual and repertorial, and I think there's a whole scroll of thoughts going through our minds constantly. We're narrating to ourselves and telling stories. So I think that what storytellers do who are writers is they take that natural instinct and the rhythms of storytelling and apply craft to it and try to make it into something more or less permanent. But it's a very natural thing. And when you see a friend who says, "Oh, I've got such a story to tell you, won't believe this," there's a little thrill because we all want to hear that. But at the same time, I have to say that there are malevolent stories too, and there are conspiracies and really sort of wicked things that are told to hurt some people. So storytelling seems to be a neutral mechanism, like a book. A book is very neutral. Not all books are equal. Some books set out to destroy civilization or set us against one another. Other books are more unifying. So it seems to be that we need some content and sort of moral direction for storytelling.
Yeah, certainly, it's I think the fundamental human activity, because for one thing, it's how we organize information. It's how we understand our histories, right, as a narrative, and having control over a narrative or a master narrative gives anyone a lot of control over society. We see that a lot happening with tweets right now. Yes.
Yeah. She's the boss of Tweetland.
But it's also the corner of a lot of our religious practices, right? There's a reason that you can read the Bhagavad Gita or the Dhammapada or the Bible, and you just don't read a list of rules, right? They're actually stories because this is how we come to understand what it means to be human and what it means to be human in the world. But I think that the importance of that is a little bit abstract, perhaps, if I describe it in that way. And there are a lot of scholars who write about the use of orality and the use of narrative. And so I'm going to actually go back to something I said when I was here for the award ceremony earlier. And I talked about two different types of narrative just related, say, to race. So you could ask yourself, like, why does this guy on stage have skin darker than mine? That's me. And there could be any number of reasons. Maybe you read the story in the Bible that attributes this dark skin to some sort of curse. We won't go into detail, but it means that it's sort of a burden, it's a mark, it's a reminder that someone before me did something wrong. That doesn't play out to positively in our history here in this country. Or you could take a different type of narrative, which is a different story about why I might have this dark skin, and borrow from Greek mythology and just take the story of Apollo's son trying to drive his chariot, being unable to control it, and it comes too close to the earth, and as a result, some people are scorched, and we get Ethiopia. These are two different stories. Neither of these stories actually scientifically explain to you why I look unlike, I think, everybody in this room. But they give you two very different senses of what that difference symbolizes. And I think that's the power of storytelling.
Well, let's get into it. Let's talk about the representation of race. Joyce had a celebrated book called The Sacrifice, which is based on the Tawana Bruley episode in New York City. And, of course, Welcome to Braggsville is... well, why don't you talk a little bit about the narrative structure of Welcome to Braggsville?
Okay.
Well, okay, I'm going to help you then. Let's do this before you say anything. So you wrote, Geronimo, I'm writing against the Horatio Alger myth, against the fallacious paradigm that accuses the poor of being lazy, and against the strained optimism of the neo-slave narrative and its artificial inoculation of literacy and liberty. So, Geronimo and Joyce, does that notion speak to you when you're reading and writing? So more generally, what are the issues, the specific challenges, the responsibilities for you reading and writing about race and racism? And Joyce, you spoke wonderfully the other night about bearing witness in fiction and about moving others to a course of action. As you write, in more recent years, American writers have written boldly across divides of class, age, ethnic identity, and gender. We must trust the human imagination, its predilections for digging at the roots of things, for prying at what is fixed, for soaring boldly into the clouds. We must hesitate to suggest boundaries, perimeters. Let us strive to dissolve borders. So, are your works that deal with race, are they a means, that's the primary reason for their existence, but are they a way to get at creating a conversation among people of difference?
It does depend upon which work you're thinking of, because probably both Geronimo and I are formalists, and we're interested in language. And so the material that we're going to shape into something is very important, but probably the initial thrill and desire is to create a text that hasn't been created before. And so in Geronimo's astonishing novel, he writes from the point of view of a white boy from the South. And it's so interesting that you chose to do that. And then I read an interview of why you did. So it was really sort of a strategic and intellectual decision that you made. You know, it wasn't something that just was intuitive and instinctive. And when I write, since I've written so many books, each book to me presents a challenge of doing something a little different, and therefore you need a different language. Sometimes you need different font. You know, the whole thing has to be somewhat different. And so you may write about subjects that somebody will think are about race, but really maybe they're about class struggle, or they're about identification, or about gradations of race, because race it's one of these fantasy words I'm not even sure what it means. Maybe some of you have read Toni Morrison's wonderful little book called The Origin of Others. Have you seen it? The Origin of Others. Toni begins the little book, it's quite slender. She begins by recounting when her grandmother came to visit her mother, and she and her sister were playing. They were quite young. The grandmother is a very straight-backed woman from, I think, the South, and she was very dark skin. So she comes in, she's she's very dignified, and she's walking with a cane. And she looks at these two little girls, and she says, somebody tampered with those two because they're a lighter skin. And she said it in a kind of accusing way, so that Tony's mother then said something that kind of, make them feel better or defend them or something. And I thought that was so interesting, first of all, that it happened, and also that Toni Morrison wrote about it. And she talks about the fetishization of skin. Like, when you think about it, it's just ridiculous. And like, why would anybody say something like that? And two little girls are sort of vulnerable and sensitive. And yet you can understand why she might say that. So when we're writing, I think we're looking for, as Shakespeare would say, sort of looking for dramatic junctures and things hitting against one another, somebody's expectations against reality. And race is part of this whole mosaic. It may be like a weaving in which, if you're writing about American culture, the race is certainly in there, but the other things are in there too, like being a woman in a patriarchal culture, being somebody who has a natural inclination to be religious, but is actually, in fact, not religious, but you have that predilection. All these things are woven together. So race is one theme, but there are other themes that are all I think, unified together. And if you pull one out, the whole thing is kind of damaged.
I agree, and I think it's because of my experience of race as being something that is always with me that I think also about gender or class, because it's very difficult for me to observe the condition of being human and not be aware that this has some effect on my interactions with other people or on my dealings with other people. And I do find that there's always this question of language in finding the form for the book. And I guess for me, it's almost like finding the perfect spoon in a way, because I'm starting with this feeling that I have, and the way for me to get the feeling into another human being's body is through this novel, right? By giving someone else an experience that will hopefully be worth the time that they spent reading, but will also hopefully maybe open the aperture of their heart somewhat more, reorient them somewhat, make it possible for them to think differently. And one of the things that I've been thinking about this, definitely in terms of Morrison and othering, and like her notion of the white gaze is like what I do and do not want to do as a novelist. And I realized early on that one of the things I did not want to do as a novelist was humanize black people. I didn't want to feel like my whole job as a writer was just to prove to readers that blacks are also human, which I feel I do see a lot in work, and that's not something that's unnecessary. It's just something that there's so many other people doing. I didn't want to jump into that pool per se, and so I feel like getting around to the class and the gender helps me think more about a little bit of what we were discussing in the green room, how I might be able to illustrate the interplay between the outer social world and the inner world of the person, because I feel like this is what everyone's struggling with. You're a human with allegedly free will, but the thing is we've inherited this world, and this world places a lot of demands on us, and this world inculcates us with a lot of opinions, and so that's the reason I use that garage metaphor when I'm on tour. I'll have to admit that there are a lot of ideas in my head that just don't belong to me. They're not my ideas. So it's like I have a garage that has cars that don't belong to me. And so it doesn't mean necessarily that I'm schizophrenic, so don't worry there, but it means that I can clearly see where I have attitudes that originated with outside of me. That I may have seen them in movies, I may have seen them in books, and it's a constant battle to be aware of which ones I should actually get in and drive, and which ones I need to ignore. And so in writing, I'm trying to maybe help other people make better decisions about the cars in their garage. Yeah.
So Joyce, you speak about that the material that you're attracted to, that ends up in your fictions, these are subjects that haunt you. There's an emotional driver behind the writing. Is there also a political? I know it depends on each book. I know that's true. But can you speak about where that comes from? I mean, following up on what Geronimo said too about what's creating the urge to create for you?
Well, it's a complex question, and as I said earlier, I think storytelling is very natural to our species. So each night when we fall asleep in our beds, we have these astonishing dreams, and they're pretty visual and imagistic. They may have some language to them, but probably not a lot of language. And they have a certain tone, like an emotional pitch. And that's just the most extraordinary kind of natural storytelling that we all experience. And sometime it may have a political, I mean, it's sort of hard to reduce things to these elements. For instance, one of the writers that I read when I was very young, and I have learned from or revered, as many people have, is Edgar Allan Poe. Now, Edgar Allan Poe, as an individual, as a historical person, may not have been a particularly attractive person, I'm not sure. But if you look at the work, it's totally ahistorical. You don't know where it takes place. It could as easily be Europe as the United States. It doesn't bear much resemblance to Baltimore or to Philadelphia or New York City, where Poe may have been living. And it doesn't have any real physical, people have no real bodies. They're like wraiths. They're like ghosts. And yet it's intensely dramatic. And if it's any kind of politics of any kind, I can't imagine what the politics would be, except maybe just conservative, because Gothic literature tends to be sort of static. There's no room for progress in Gothic literature. It's a timeless limbo, and nothing much is going to happen. Like you wouldn't want to know what Heathcliff's politics are, you know. It would probably be disappointing. We don't really know that because he's such a primitive and primeval person. So that's the kind of writing that I'm actually very drawn to, and I find it very haunting. And the dreams that people have and some dreams that I have are ineffable. They can't be expressed in language. So you try to approximate them by telling a story, you try to approximate that experience, but it's basically ineffable and mysterious. And then politics comes along much later. I think politics in terms of civilization is basically the art of compromise. You may have fanatics and extremes, but people who are practiced politicians, they have a responsibility to the greatest good for the greatest number of people in a sort of utilitarian, democratic, egalitarian world, and therefore they have to make compromises, and by doing that, they often compromise their own idealism. So politics, by its nature, is a kind of gritty, utilitarian process of getting something done, but I don't think that it can be really idealistic. Who was it said that perfection is the enemy of the good? You want perfection, you want a perfect candidate, you'll never find that perfect candidate. But you have to try to find good solutions and a good political process.
Can you talk about haunting? Things that haunt you?
I think that one of the things that still kind of amazes me is just being alive.
Yes.
Like, I'm here in this body, in this room. I can't tell you why. Some scientists could tell you what they think. Some religious folks could tell you what they think. But the miracle of this moment of being alive is something I can't fully explain. It seems very like precious and valuable, though I often forget this. But it's this odd experience, I think, that haunts me. This, like, being aware of being alive, being aware of that moment passing, being aware of being an impermanent being, and the various things that influence the change in that being from moment to moment. And so I think this is one of the reasons that, for me, I'm drawn to the question of, the political, everything seems in a way political to me, because I'm really always kind of haunted by these situations where people, for whatever reason, can't be fully actualized, right? They can't fully make the most of this moment of their body, of their life, or being alive. And of course, we have tremendous control over ourselves. I can't blame anything for anyone else anything in my life, but that went wrong. But at the same time, it does feel to me when I look at the world that I see a lot of people who don't have the opportunities to be fully actualized, or for various reasons are being like stifled or held back. I think that the Me Too movement encapsulates that in many ways. And so as a writer, I'm interested in exploring that, because I feel like it's part of, hopefully, the larger discussion that will illuminate ways in which we can be better, or perhaps illustrate to those who are just part of this larger family of humanity the ways in which we need to make changes, which is in a way saying the same thing, the way that we can be better. But I guess that what I'm trying to say, and the second part, is to try to illustrate the way in which we can be more helpful in the way in which some of our social structures do prevent people from reaching their full telos or fully blossoming. I'm just big into human achievement.
So both of you are hitting on this mystery of being alive in this time. As most writers think, well, I would not prefer to live any other time. This is the life I've gotten. This is the time I'm in. So I'd like you to reflect, both of you, upon your writing. And Joyce, you said something at one point that, well, for one thing, when you fill out, when anybody asks your occupation, you don't put writer. You put teacher.
Teacher.
You could put rabbi, I suppose. That was the same thing. And it's fascinating is that the term writer kind of bugs you a little bit. It's the writing, it's an act of writing and being a writer. There's something about that doesn't work for you, I think. So what is it for both of you being a writer? There I go again. When you're writing, is that when you're most alive? Or is it when you're feeding your cats, or when you're dealing with your partner? Or is it, when do you feel most alive? When you see the galleys of the next book? Is that the thing?
We probably feel alive most of the time. It just seems pretentious to say, like, I'm a writer or a poet or I'm a genius. The only person who would do that would be Oscar Wilde, sort of shamelessly, he was a genius. I have nothing to declare but my genius, he said when he went through customs. It's kind of wonderful. And he's all dressed in a sealskin coat and kind of pink shirt and a whole lot of rings on his fingers. So that was what he was doing. It was his sort of public persona. But Oscar Wilde, too, had an inner self, and was very, very troubled and anguished. And as I said before, I think that while we have a slightly we sound didactic here. We sound much more dogmatic and didactic than our writing is. Braggsville is a lot of fun to read. Yeah. And I think it was audacious and rowdy to write it. You're writing something that's very playful, and I like to think of some of my writing as playful, and you're jabbing people in the ribs. And it's not really didactic, and one can be very grave afterward and say, well, I did this, for the good of humanity. But actually, when you're writing, it's kind of fun. It's like maybe playing your musical instrument for nobody's listening, and you're just sort of enjoying that sound of the musical instrument.
Yeah, you said you spend most of your day looking out the window.
Hell, I do.
That's true. And you, when you were last here, you said you work in a cloffice, which is a closet that doubles as an office. So
you don't look out the window?
The window's a little too high for me to peer through from the desk. Yeah.
Well, maybe when you've gotten to the point I'm at, after all these other books, you can reward yourself with a nice view of the San Francisco Bay or something. Because when things are not going so well with the writing, then you look out the window. And you see birds, and you sort of see another world, and you look at the clouds, and it's sort of like a different world. The one thing I don't like is to be caught in some sort of stasis, caught in my own mind. I want to know that there's another world out there.
Well, how about Rome? There's a venue for you to peer out upon.
There is, but my window there just looks out into the courtyard. So,
A lot of shenanigans going on.
Not too much of a view there. So writing is a lot of fun, and I think about this a lot because I do enjoy writing. It gives me a certain kind of electricity in the brain. I enjoy the process of writing. The language is something that's very much alive to me. And then at the same time, I feel this weight, right? And I always have to roll this back when I'm teaching because I don't want the students to feel like they have this weight on them. But then I'm only one generation off of a farm. My parents did a lot in order to achieve their levels of education and educate me, and so I kind of almost feel, not almost, but do feel this obligation to make the most of my opportunity as a writer. So there's this balance between enjoying it a lot and feeling that I have to make good use of the voice because it's not just an opportunity, but it's also a gift, and also that there's some duty bound into it, And so I'm always wrestling with that. And, the odd thing is that while it might feel like pressure in a way when the writing gets rough, that's when it's not a pressure. And so when I was really struggling with Hold It Till It Hurts, which was a darker, heavier novel, I would remind myself that the people I was writing about and the people I was thinking about who were returning from war or who had actually been in New Orleans when Katrina hit had a much more difficult time of things. All I had to do was sit here at the desk and keep putting one word after the next. So I have this kind of complicated relationship with this more somber element of what I do, but of course, yes, in the practice of writing, it's very, 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 it's extraordinarily pleasurable. It feels almost criminal. It feels almost criminal to me, yeah.
Particularly the revision.
Mm-hmm.
The revision.
Yes.
Yeah.
The first time through is arduous.
Yeah.
So the revision is the fun. I don't want to get too writer conferencey and bread loafish, but I mean, so the fun part is the revision?
For me, what about?
For me, probably the first draft. If I have to be willing to know I'm writing something that I'm going to revise, so that I can relax and just enjoy the process of kind of creating the narrative. Yeah.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
What do you think about that question, Joe?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that, Jim.
How would you answer that same question?
About
writing,
the pleasure?
Writing and when is the most fun part of it? Is it the revision? Is it the initial? What is it?
I'm Catholic, so he's asking what pleasure do I take in writing. None of your business. No, I think it's a thrill writing a sentence. I think the sentence by sentence is the most fun. I mean, which raises a big question about, what gets your stories going? Darren was got your Braggsville going, and you speak a lot about character as being the engine for this, for your fictions. You hear voices. You're not schizophrenic. You hear voices and these voices teach you things. Or they teach to you themselves, because your stories, as you would say, Joyce, you write about someone not yourself. And that's sort of what happened with you in Braggsville, too, where Darren becomes the focal point of this amazing story.
We're also interested in form, and I would love to wake up tomorrow morning and have a new idea for just the form of something. You all know, let's say, Tim O'Brien's The Things I Carried.
Great story.
Now, that's so great because of the form that he either just invented it, or it occurred to him in some intuitive way. But it's such a masterpiece of form. It has what we call incremental repetition, where each stories are told again and again, each time a little more is told. The things they carried this, they carried that. And some of the paragraphs and passages are just incredible prose poetry. They carried the earth, they carried the sun, they carried all their lives. It's like an incantation. Had he taken the story of Lieutenant Lavender, who's killed, and the other men reacting to it, had he written that in a conventional way, I don't think we'd even know about it. I don't think we'd remember it, because he found such an inventive and musical form for it.
It's great. Their eyes leak at one point. Instead of weeping, their eyes leak. And it's an astonishing story.
I have a question for Joyce and Geronimo. When you knew you were going to be in conversation with one another, what kinds of questions were rolling around in your head?
I can answer that. They wanted to know, when is the bar open?
What questions did you have for one another, or do you have for one another that have come out of this evening?
Well, I would have a lot of questions for Geronimo. He was studying at Iowa. So do you want to say a few words of what you learned there, or did you not learn anything, or was there something that you would have reacted against, or something, whatever?
I think all of that's true. There are times where it felt like I wasn't, then I was learning, but I learned a lot. And I was at Stanford before I was at Iowa, and so I was fortunate enough to have 4 years of this formal workshop instruction, and during that period, my question of inspiration kind of fell by the wayside for a moment, because there's no question about whether or not I wanted to write, but what was suddenly before me was the notion that you could make decisions and that you could think about how elements of a text function. So what's happening with like the mimetic symbolism, what's happening with this type of sentence versus that type of sentence, or John LaRoe talked a lot about scenes, and when I was studying with John, this was early at Stanford, that was what really opened the door. And I remember him asking another writer, even if it was me, I'd claim it was another writer, but no, it really was another writer, about this dream that was in the writer's story. And John said, well, why is it a dream? Why is it a dream? And he was insistent, and the writer couldn't really answer. And John's point was, what are you getting out of making this a dream that you couldn't get out of making it a scene? Why does it have to happen in this extra dimensional space, right? Yeah. And it's sort of like, bam, the roof came off of the building, and I never thought about writing, the same ever again. And so gradually, I feel like what I learned between Stanford and Iowa is that for each project, I needed to develop this kind of hermetic language, like this is the language of this project. And if I'm consistent, then this project will work. It will have its own structure and emotion. This doesn't mean it will work for every reader, but for the readers for whom it does work, they'll be able to take pleasure in being immersed in that particular system, And so I think a lot of what I thought about writing before I went in was more about the notion of divine inspiration, right? And waiting for divine inspiration. And I'm really, really grateful for having been at Stanford and Iowa with people who were working so hard and made it so clear that it is about the work.
It's a craft.
Right.
I used to know John LaRoe. We were friends, but we sort of drifted apart. And who did you study with at Iowa?
So Sam Chang, Ethan Kanan, Jen McPherson.
Dean.
Yeah, Dean Young. I'm forgetting a couple of names.
James McPherson is sort of a legendary person, isn't he?
He is.
Yeah.
And you understand as soon as you're in the room with him for a couple minutes why.
Well, all these people are very distinctly individual. And I've never met James McPherson. But when you meet somebody who is so special, you sort of see why that person's a writer and why that person writes the way he does. Like nobody else is going to write that way. And so it's almost as if character is destiny. You know, like the person you are is going to write in a certain way no matter what.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you would reject the idea that that the charge that's often made against MFA programs, oh, you just produce MFA-type poetry or MFA-type stories.
Well, there's nothing like that. I mean, there are all sorts of different people.
Yeah, okay.
All sorts of different poets are teaching. And each of them, I think, is pretty distinguished and eccentric, but they're all very different from one another. For instance, at NYU, Sharon Olds is teaching, and we share the same office. Sharon Olds is a certain kind of poet. She's very distinctive. She has her own followers. She's extremely passionate. But Yusuf Komunyak is also teaching in the department. Mm-hmm. He's a formalist. He writes about race matters and things like that, but he's much a formalist and like a classicist. Sharon is a real passionate feminist and maybe descended a bit from Anne Sexton, Sylvia Plath. Yusuf Komunyak perhaps has 18th century models. I mean, they're in the same department and have some of the same students. Probably the students are not writing like either one of them.
We have a few questions from the audience.
Yes, hi. This question's kind of specifically Professor Oates. I'm not sure how to address you, but it's for you. I wrote my junior year research paper on you, and so I'm really fangirling. But the three books that I pretty closely analyzed and read word by word were Foxfire, Blackwater, and Fair Maiden, and they each attack or are pretty exploitive of the gratuitous sexual exploitation of women by men of power. And I kind of want to know, and it's amazing how timelessly you examine how women react and hold and almost embrace the experiences that they have and how they hold them with. And it's hard for me to see a difference in my experience as a woman 75 years later from when it was written or when the time period is. So I kind of want to know, with everything that's going on with the Me Too movement and especially in how it's portrayed in the media, what your thoughts are on it. And I'm really honored to see you.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's an interesting trio of novels because when I look back on it now, I can definitely see that thread. And the Foxfire novel, in some ways, is more like our time right now, like the Me Too movement and taking power away from the patriarch. Whereas Blackwater is more like a retrogressive experience where the young woman is a victim and she succumbs to the male with a lot of power. Then A Fair Maiden is it's sort of a different sort of, almost like a posthumous, the masculine force is all played out, and now he seeks the fair maiden. In effect, he wants her to kill him. He wants to die by her hand. So it's sort of a late quasi-posthumous vision of that patriarchal culture. But the Foxfire is the most fun of those novels because the girls form a gang. By taking back the power that men have, they find they have such power in numbers and the bond between them. Often in novels and literature, people don't have bonds with one another. The dramas are played out more in isolation. But in that novel, the girls really are friends, and they really are sisters, and are in this gang together. And if something happens to one of them, it happens to all of them, so they're protecting one another. So I would like to think that novel is a little more for the present time and the Me Too movement, where there's a sense of community.
Questions?
Yeah, a bunch of questions here. Vicki, there's one over there.
Hi. I was excited you brought up revision because as an MFA writing student, it's something that I am learning a lot about and dealing with a lot, so sorry to make this writers' conference-y. But I'm curious as to what advice and guidance you give your students when it comes to the revision process and how to look at that look at it as kind of what's going to happen in the future as they're writing in the present.
Well, is this for both of us?
Good.
Well, one thing I think is very helpful when revising is to sort of thin slice it. Think of it like those Gray's Anatomy books, where each cellophane sheet shows a different system of the body, and this makes it more manageable. So sometimes someone goes to a novel 300 pages and they just say, I'm going to revise it. And that's, I feel like, trying to frost a cake that's still batter in a bowl. and so what's more useful is to say, I'm going to look at dialogue, or, if you want to get more granular, one character's dialogue. I'm going to look at, sentences only, apart from necessarily content and meaning. I'm just going to look at kind of structure and the flow of energy in the words, and so forth and so on. And so that's one bit of advice that I give, and it's something that I like talking about because it's clear and it's actionable, and it doesn't require any special skill. It's something that you can start doing immediately, and it lets you take a large project and focus on it at a level of detail that's manageable.
Well, to me, revision is very magical and thrilling, and it's the kind of creativity that we all yearn for. So much of it depends upon what you're doing that very day. For instance, I say to my students, if they ask me about revision, I say, just wait a while, and in the meantime, read some Henry James. How about, have you read Ulysses yet? Go for a long walk. Don't bring anybody with you so that you don't chatter, but just go for a long walk. Because then the next day when you go back to your revisions, you're going to be a much more richer person. Just one night of dreams. Or to put the novel in the drawer, I put all my writing away usually sometimes for a year, and I take it out again. I'm thinking about it, but I'm not working on it. So when I take it out after a year, I'm very, very coolly critical. I have a lot of emotional distance from it. So the most important thing then is to read it quickly as a reader would, to see what the pacing is. Because when you're struggling over sentences, passages can be very turgid, and you really polish them, and so you feel attached to them. But then when you read it, you say, that's too long. And you just cross it out. Something you spent a day on, you just cross out. But you can't do that immediately. You have to put a little time between the execution and the critical reading.
In fact, part of the agreement tonight was that after you listen to everybody up here, you'll be able to revise everything. It'll just cleanse your imagination immediately. I saw a bunch of hands.
Hi, in spending time in Berkeley or the Bay Area, are there dreams or experiences that have really stood out?
Did you go to college? You went to university here.
Yeah. For grad school, yeah.
Could you say that question again, please?
In spending time in Berkeley or the Bay Area, are there experiences or dreams, we were talking about dreams before, that really stood out?
Well, there's that wonderful passage in Braggsville where you described the Bay Area. You're looking out on the water. You talked about it on the Krasny show, and it was beautiful. That seeing the Bay Area for the first time is astonishing. We're looking outside your window on Panoramic there. You see just immense life with squirrels.
Well, I've written a little bit about this area, but maybe I will more in the future. I'm not from here, so it's more like almost like a tourist looking at things. And the subjects I tend to write about I really know so well from my background.
I was in Union Square one night, and maybe 100 rollerbladers. This isn't the novel, but it's true. They zipped into Union Square and they performed an impressively well choreographed performance of Michael Jackson's Thriller on rollerblades.
Wow.
And I was like,
That's amazing.
that could happen somewhere else, but no, not really. And then I was like, I don't even think it would happen in New York. It was just a little bit too effervescent, the mood. And then they left by BART, right? So they all zipped down Powell, and they did fancy tricks down the escalator, even if they were on the escalator that was going up. So, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Wait till we're done here. Yes.
Ms. Oates' comment about read Ulysses segues into my question for both of you. It's sort of a two-parter. What do you want your students to be reading, and what are you currently reading yourselves?
I do a lot of reading for review. So I'm reading the novels by Richard Flanagan, who's an Australian writer. And I tend to read in a cluster. Like if I'm going to be reviewing a book for the New York Review of Books, I tend to read back titles. So for the students, we have an anthology, so I give them assignments. And for tomorrow, they're reading Jean Toomer and Ralph Ellison. They're reading Battle Royal and Blood Burning Moon. So they have some powerful work. They're going to be reading Flannery O'Connor. They have read Faulkner. They read Hemingway. So reading, I tell them to read. I assign classics, and then we spend time going over the stories in class. These are all beautifully written stories. The craft is beautiful. The language is extraordinary. And the role that the writers like Hemingway and Faulkner played historically is so important also.
I tend to, we tend not to have anthologies in a lot of the graduate workshops, so it ends up being a case where I look at what the student's working on and then make some suggestions based on that. But right now I'm reading Beautiful People. I'm sorry, Beautiful Days. Right. A little bit of jet lag. Beautiful Days. You are beautiful people. I'm reading Beautiful Days, and I'm rereading Living by Henry Green, and it feels completely new again. There's something about it, being so dialogue heavy, right? And then I'm reading it's the fourth book, the fourth Ferrante novel. I started with the second and worked my way up to the fourth, and then I'm going to go back to the first in a few weeks. Yeah, so it's different stuff, and then a book on paganism and sacrifice in early Christianity.
Wow.
Yeah.
All at once.
Yeah. I think the second one is the best one. But
The Story of a New Name.
Yeah. And plus, they really can't drive in Naples. There are sidewalks that are all about cars.
Yes.
Any other questions? Vicky, you want to try that?
So this question is for both of you. I think a lot of times in our lives we have a seminal moment where we just know what you want to do or how you want to do it or how you click. Do either of you remember that moment when you had that thought of, I have to write to live, or write to breathe, or breathe to write, or anything in your life that caused that click because of your proclivity and everything you're doing? I mean, it's just amazing. When was that moment, and would you be so kind to share?
Well, my answer is pretty brief because I have actually never had that moment. I'm waiting.
I haven't had that moment either. I often feel like it's not that I decided to become a writer, it's just that I never stopped being a writer. I was fortunate enough to have a path through school where I was always able to participate in English classes in ways that were rewarding and stimulating. But I did have to make a decision. It took a really long time for me to sell Hold It. Not a long time. It felt like a long time to me, 9 months to find an agent, another 12 months to sell it. And it was very close to my heart because part of it was around Katrina. And at the end of this whole process, after having read the rejection emails for a year, I realized that I was feeling quite hurt, right, from reading all the rejection emails, and I had to kind of decide: am I going to do this, or am I not going to do this? Because there are going to be a lot more of these rejection emails. Why am I doing this? Why does it matter to me? Am I willing to endure this bruising of the ego? And I decided that I was, that I enjoyed it enough, and I'm glad that I made that decision. Yeah.
And Joyce, you never received a rejection letter. Is that correct?
Oh, of course I have, but I started writing before I could actually write. I was scribbling with Crayolas. I think I've probably written about this. So I began being, quote, creative, such an embarrassing word, when I was just so young, that I never made any decision about anything. And as Geronimo said, I wasn't stopped. Nobody stopped me.
Yeah, it was. So really, storytelling is the foundation of literacy for you. Learning how to, you found the story before you had the words. I think our work here is done tonight. Well, I want to thank you all for coming. We've had a good conversation. This is not the last conversation that we'll ever have about writers and writing, but people are going to be talking about Joyce Carol Oates and T. Geronimo Johnson for a long time. Thank you so much for being here. Another thank you to Joyce and Geronimo, please. That work? Good. Thank you, Joyce. Thank you.
So just a quick announcement.
Yeah.
Joyce and Geronimo will be signing books up on the stage. If you are interested in purchasing a book, a good place for books is selling books out in the lobby. And if you would line up right by the podium there, you can come and have them sign their books and meet them.
I have a million questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's what always happens. It goes so fast.